Narrative and story have become an essential part of the video game experience. Whether it's a simple narrative that has been done a million times or one that covers extremely complex issues like grief, a good story can elevate a simple game to new heights in the eyes of the gaming community. However, there are times when the narrative doesn't quite fit the game you're playing. The story is telling you one thing, but the gameplay is acting in a completely different way. Think Overwatch, for example. Quite a few characters are either members of the hero group Overwatch or the terrorist group Talon. Yet in gameplay, members of Overwatch and Talon sometimes play on the same team, even sworn enemies. Meanwhile, the narrative is telling you this would never happen. This occurrence is called Ludonarrative Dissonance, a term coined by Clint Hawking in 2007. Essentially, ludonarrative dissonance is the conflict between a video game's narrative told through the story and the narrative told through the gameplay. According to Leslie A. Howie in Ludonarrative Dissonance and Dominant Narratives, ludonarrative dissonance occurs when the narrative and ludic structures of a game meet in a way in such the player is thrown out of the game. Jesper Juhl says in Games Telling Stories, a brief note on games and narratives, that the story time of a game is now, since the player can influence events. This causes games to have an emotional weight to them. A lack of consistency can cause a player to no longer be immersed in a game, breaking the tension and ruining the atmosphere. And there's no game where atmosphere is more important than horror games. In horror games, the atmosphere and tension is imperative to creating a fun and meaningful experience. You want to be scared by a horror game. This is why ludonarrative dissonance can severely hurt a horror game. Take Bioshock, for example, the game that caused Hawking to even come up with the term in the first place. Hawking states, in the game's mechanics, you are offered the freedom to choose to adopt an objectivist approach. But you also have the freedom to reject that approach and rescue the Little Sisters, even though it is not in your best interest to do so. In the game's fiction, on the other hand, you do not have the freedom to choose between helping Atlas or not. The game's narrative is essentially forcing you to do something out of character by not giving you a choice. So the easy conclusion to gain from this is ludonarrative dissonance is bad, and if it exists in a game, it's a negative, right? Well, not exactly. When done wrong, ludonarrative dissonance takes away from an experience. But, as Evgenia Kutsanova states, under the right circumstances, an explicit imbalance between gameplay and story can itself serve a narrative purpose, invoking a dissonance as part of a storytelling argument. Essentially, ludonarrative dissonance can actually enhance gameplay, but only when it's used as a purposeful story element to further the story. And a game that exemplifies this positive use of ludonarrative dissonance is the beloved RPG Maker game, The Witch's House. The Witch's House is a survival horror game created by a Japanese developer going by the name of Fumi. The game follows a young girl named Viola, who wakes up in the middle of a forest alone. She soon discovers her way back home is blocked by some seemingly magical roses. With no other options, Viola enters the house in the middle of the forest, looking for a way out. She's accompanied by a friendly talking cat. The house begins to shift and change, becoming a maze, as Viola must solve puzzles and avoid a brutal death. She finds diaries written by the witch, a young girl named Ellen, who murders her parents due to the mistreatment of her, caused by Ellen's severe illness. We also learned that Viola befriended Ellen. Ellen sees an opportunity to rid herself of her painful illness, and is attempting to swap bodies with Viola. Eventually, Viola escapes the house. Her father shoots a severely mutilated Ellen, killing her and allowing the family to go home safely. The story seems relatively simple, so how does ludonarrative dissonance play a factor into the game? And even more so, how does it improve the story? Well, it has to revolve around the character Viola. Overall, the narrative gives us an image of Viola where she is super sweet, kind, caring, and empathetic. However, this is where the ludonarrative dissonance comes in. The gameplay doesn't exactly match with this narrative storytelling. After being locked in the house, Viola is forced to start solving puzzles, the first one being having to put two bears together in a basket. Unfortunately, the second bear won't fit, so instead, Viola cuts off its limbs of the bear and shoves them into the basket. A little weird, but nothing too out of character. Well, that's true until you hear the bear shriek in pain and see blood pool out of where its missing limbs used to be. And sweet, caring Viola? Well, she doesn't react at all. Viola remains seemingly unfazed by what she faces during her adventure, even when the player makes her step and crush human remains, or when she has to kill a sentient flower and a few baby tadpoles for her own gain. Viola reacts to none of this, which starkly contrasts the personality that the narrative is giving us. This disconnect and ludonarrative dissonance is most noticeable with the frog Viola meets. This frog is a helpful companion to Viola, crossing bridges she's too big to, and helping her solve other puzzles. The frog joins Viola after she shows him some affection, and the two get along nicely. However, Viola eventually comes to a door where there's a small slot and a giant hungry snake on the other side. The gameplay has you feed your beloved companion to the snake, forcing the frog into the slot as he tries to escape. Once again, Viola doesn't react. No remorse from the empathetic girl. It's clear something is off with Viola. There's one other big element of ludonarrative dissonance that has to do with the house. Throughout the game, you are given clues to solve puzzles through notes in different rooms. Narratively, these make no sense. Ellen wouldn't be helping you. She's trying to kill Viola. Unless she left them there for her own use, but if the witch controls the house, why would she need hints for her own puzzles? Narratively, there's no reason for this, but the gameplay needed a way to explain the puzzles to the players. That's all this is, right? So obviously, ludonarrative dissonance exists in this game, and there's actually quite a lot of it for such a short game. But how does it improve the story? Well, it doesn't make sense unless the player unlocks the true ending of the game. In the true ending, we learn that before the game had even started, Ellen and Viola performed a spell to switch bodies, meaning this entire time, the player was actually playing Ellen in Viola's body. Viola, now stuck in Ellen's body, attempts to trap Ellen so the two can switch back. All of a sudden, all the instances of ludonarrative dissonance make sense. It's actually the murderous Ellen who was calm the entire time because the house still obeys her soul. Hence, the notes lying around the house. The easiest ending to get in the game actually skips this entire revelation. So for most people's first playthroughs, the ludonarrative dissonance would make no sense. But because of these little moments, it's even more emotionally impactful and even more gratifying for the player when they learn the truth. Ludonarrative dissonance doesn't always have to be a bad thing. In fact, it can be a very useful tool for game developers to make a unique, impactful story, just like how Fumi did with The Witch's House.